Well, hello there, and welcome to another Warbird Wednesday. I'm Fred Bell, the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum, and today we're going to talk about two more artifacts that crossed paths in the Second World War. And the interesting thing about all this is all of the fighter pilots, whether you go back to World War I or whatever, can trace their heritage back to these winged warriors, these winged gods, and as you can certainly see, I am extremely bored at the Palm Springs Air Museum. And so with that, I'm going to take off my winged helmet. I'm going to toss it to my voluptuous assistant, Greg, who is social distancing off camera. We're going to talk about today is early and pre-World War II. We're going to talk about two different artifacts that these weapons crossed paths. Maybe not directly, but they were in the same theater. So you have to remember, when the Japanese were expanding in the mid-30s, they were expanding into China and Korea, Manchuria, up in that area there. And what they were doing was they were very concerned. Japan had industrialized, and they were very concerned about having resources and having enough resources to be able to run their economy. And they were afraid that the colonial powers, and they also looked at the United States as a colonial power, so you're talking about the British, the French, the Dutch, that they were going to use material or economics against Japan. And Japan decided that they just couldn't tolerate that. They needed to directly control the right or wrong, the resources that went into their country. So they started a very aggressive expansion. Now you have to remember, this was Imperial Japan. The emperor was a god. He owned everything, more or less. In other words, everything was the emperor. You all served at the pleasure of the emperor. If you were a warrior, no matter what service you were in, your duty was to protect the emperor's interests, and if necessary, die to protect the emperor and Japan. And so the mindset of the Japanese at that time was quite a bit different from anybody else, but they were expanding aggressively. And one of the artifacts I'm going to talk about today is this rifle. This is an Arasaka Type 99 short rifle. First of all, I want to be very clear. This is an inert weapon. It has been rendered inoperable. It's for display purposes. It's an exhibit only. But this weapon has a very interesting story. And that is that this weapon we can actually trace back to a Japanese master sergeant who lost his life in Luzon in 1944. And how do we know that? Well, what was going on at that time was, if you were a Marine or you were a service member and you were fighting in the Pacific, and let's say you found this weapon laying on the ground or whatever, you could go to your quartermaster or your postmaster of your unit, have it crated up and sent home. This weapon was picked up by a Marine in the Philippines and was sent home crated. It was donated to the museum many years ago. Now, when you come to the museum, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'm just going to give you the top of it because I want you to hear about his story. But this weapon was donated to the museum. When the weapon was donated, there were enough artifacts with the weapon that we were able to identify the soldier that actually owned this weapon and trace him all the way back to Korea in 1937. So this weapon has a history to it. And we have to remember that these artifacts, we talk about specifics and the various what they did and whatever, but these were all either carried or flown or whatever by human beings. And the human beings are important in this story. So this master sergeant started his career in Korea, and as far as we can tell, about 1937. This weapon was a replacement, the Type 99, for the Type 35 rifle. And the idea behind this weapon was that this was bolt action. This bolt worked, so it closed. I have what's called a stripper clip here. Now, for you aficionados, by the way, this is all inert. You see they have holes in them. But a stripper clip, this fit in this notch. And by the way, these are .303 rounds. This is a 7.7 millimeter weapon. That's the shell that it fired. They just don't exist anymore. You can't find them. But this stripper clip went in there. You depress that down, and this back of the clip, the rounds, the bullets would go in, and then this piece would come off. It would be discarded. That's why it was called a stripper clip. You have to remember, this is a cartridge. This little tippy point, as I've said before, is what leaves the rifle. So those went in there, and then the Japanese soldier would fire it, and he would use this bolt to eject the cartridges out of the top. Now, a couple of other interesting things on this rifle. By the way, this thing is bloody heavy. And glamorous Greg, I don't know if you can get a shot of that, but on the top of this rifle is a dead giveaway that chrysanthemum, that piece right there, that is the stamp of the Imperial Armory. There were 7 armories in Japan that made these rifles. There were 2 outside of Japan. This particular rifle was made from the marks on the serial numbers, which are on the back of this bolt. We can trace this rifle back to an armory in Japan. Now, this weapon was given to this soldier. The other characteristic that it had, some people think this is a sniper sight. It is not. It is actually an anti-aircraft sight, which is elevation, so you can shoot at airplanes. It has on it a bayonet. This is a Japanese Type 30 bayonet. It was also made, there's another interesting mark on this right there. Greg, I don't know if you can get that. That little mark right there tells us that this was made in one of the armories in Japan sometime between 1895 and about 1935. Now, how can you tell that this is an early war Japanese bayonet? And how can you tell that? That is because this bayonet has this little hook thing is called a quillin. And what a quillin was designed to do, and there, by the way, there are some debates on this. Some people say that this piece was to stack the rifle, so this was like a hook, so you could stack the rifles with the bayonets. Other people say that this is a holdover from the old weapons, like swords, where I'm going to use this paint stir as an example, where it would come down the blade and get caught. And the idea was that you could catch the blade of your enemy, right, and it didn't slip down. Well, remember, if it slipped down, and a lot of ancient weapons had this, and the idea behind this was to keep this blade from going down. First of all, you can see where my hand is. If this slips off and I'm holding this, this is going to end up in my hands. The enemy blade is going to be in my hands. So it is plausible that this could be a catch. The reality of this weapon is it's fairly heavy, and if you have fixed bayonets, this means that your enemy is close to you, and this at this point, because this is a bolt-activated rifle or bolt mechanical rifle, if you fix bayonets, and Japanese would do this in bonsai charges and in combat, this then becomes what in medieval warfare was nothing more than a pike. You can see how I'm holding it, and this becomes essentially a spear. This, or a javelin, this weapon with this bayonet can trace, if you're using it at an inert level, in other words, there's no bullets, and you're using it to protect yourself, this is essentially nothing more than a stabbing weapon. And the idea behind it is you're having a bad day. If you fix bayonets and you're up close with somebody like that, this is all the way back to the Spartans and the Hoplites. This is ancient warfare. So this weapon, we know, was in China. Now, how do we tie all this together? Well, what we're going to do is behind me is a Curtiss P-40. Now, this aircraft is as well known for the American volunteer group that fought in China before the war with Claire Chennault, and it has a very, very interesting history. This aircraft first flew in the late 1930s, I think about 1937. When it flew, it was this new wave of low-wing pursuit fighters, or they're getting ready to buy planes. We've already talked about that. And the Army, although there's been much made that the United States was not ready for World War II, the reality of it was they were rearming. They were not tone deaf to what was happening in North Africa with the Italians, Spain with the Germans, and what the Japanese were doing in China and in Korea. And they realized that they needed to update their weapons. You got to remember the Axis powers, which were those powers that I just mentioned, were testing a lot of weapons in various theaters of the war at that time, pre-war at that time, and they were getting a lot of valuable information. The United States was beginning to rearm. Britain went into the war earlier than we did against the Germans, and then we obviously were dragged into the war at Pearl Harbor, but everybody was rearming. This aircraft was part of that. When it originally flew, it flew at about 316 miles an hour. Why not be specific? On the test, they weren't really happy with that, so they took it back to wind tunnels. They did a lot of work on the front end of the airplane and the leading edge, and the airplane got up to, in the pre-production iterations, got up to about 350, 360 miles an hour. This has an Allison engine in it, which is an American engine. There were some Packard Merlin engines built in this aircraft with higher speeds, but they were stripped down versions of this airplane. But the predominant performance on this airplane was roughly about 350, 360 miles an hour. Very noticeable radiator intake, your exhaust. Now let's talk about the shark teeth for a second. There's a lot of debate about where the shark teeth came from. The Germans actually had shark teeth on an airplane called the Me-110, the Messerschmitt 110, very early in the war, or very early in the operation of that airplane. This shark teeth supposedly, and then the British had it, and then the Americans adopted it in China. I have seen things, and I would accept that you have to remember the Japanese were very superstitious. There was a lot of symbolism. And these airplanes with this big shark mouth in combat, when they first ran into them, probably were pretty terrifying to them. They were flying Zeeks with zeros, which we talked about. They were flying Ki-43s, which is called an Oscar. Remember, those are the Allied code names. And the American pilots, again, volunteer group, the American volunteer group, were fighting there before the war. Now, what I have here is a P-40B. This is a variant of this airplane. This is actually signed by Tex Hill. And you can look Tex up. He was one of the aces of the American volunteer group. This is a configuration of that aircraft in China. 250 caliber machine guns, 303 in the cowling, or a 30 caliber, and lighter armament. You can see this aircraft actually has the Chinese roundel on it, which is what they were flying under. The Flying Tigers against the Japanese had about 300 kills to about, and that's aerial victories, to about 4 or 5 losses of aircraft. Now, how did they do that? We've talked about tendencies. The pilots that were fighting in China with Clerchenal figured out very quickly that they could use the tendencies of this airplane to its advantage. It had a very, very good dive, high dive speed, and a very tight turn. It was one of the tightest turning in a dive Allied airplanes at the time. You got to remember, this was a grim business for Allied pilots at this time, either pre-war or in the war, and I'm talking about anybody that was flying against the Japanese. You had about a 50-50 chance that you were going to come back if you went into aerial combat. In some cases, depending on the airplane that you were flying, the odds were much worse than that. And when we go to air shows, you can see this airplane is really shiny, and you see the young guys flying them, younger guys in World War II. There are, to my knowledge, no World War II guys still flying. It was a grim business. They strapped this airplane on, they went out, they may not come back. They did it every day. And they were flying in equipment that was maybe comparable to or inferior to their adversaries. This was early in the war. Now, remember, the P-40 had the tactic that we talked about last week where, you have your height, you have your tendency of your airplane, and you dive on your target. They called that the boom and zoom. They would get in there, they'd come down, shoot them, and then zoom back up. Claire Chennault told his pilots, do not dogfight with the Zeros. Remember, the Zero was designed to be extremely maneuverable, and when it started to maneuver, it lost energy. It would slow down. It had a very low stall speed. A stall speed is where the wing loses lift, and the combat in the Pacific was anywhere from 5 to 14,000 feet. So they were flying at lower altitudes than what they were flying in Europe, in Northern Europe at that time. And it only had a single-stage supercharger. A single-stage supercharger, in layman's term, what a supercharger does is it basically forces air into the engine and creates a higher rate of combustion because there's more oxygen in there and it gives the airplane more power. This airplane was not effective above about 15,000 feet. And so it was extremely effective in the Pacific where they were fighting at that altitudes. The Zero also, when they were in a dive, this airplane was controllable in a dive. Japanese engineers figured out with Zeros, they actually put hydraulic or mechanical assisted controls in some Zeros. And what they found out was, remember the Zero was lightly constructed, that they would overstress the wings. In layman terms, when you're overstressing the wings, that means that you're going to break the wings off the airplane. So they realized to not do that, and so the Zero did not have good high-speed handling characteristics. Just didn't do well. This airplane was so rugged that there are reports of Allied pilots in this airplane actually ramming other aircraft. It was that tough and surviving that ramming. Now, the Americans used this airplane throughout the Pacific. The British were fighting in North Africa with this airplane under Lend-Lease. The Soviets had this aircraft and were using this aircraft in Russia. Now, in North Africa, the British used these airplanes that they were so effective that the Germans actually retired the Me-109E in that theater and went to that's the Messerschmitt 109E version, and went to the F version because this airplane was giving them so much trouble. This airplane has not been well recognized as an air superiority fighter, but there were a number of countries that were using it, and up until about mid-1943, it was fairly effective. At that point, it got relegated to either just combat fighter sweep patrols and a lot of ground attack work. It could carry bombs, it could do other things. But early in the war, this was the airplane that you wanted to have because it was one of the better ones that we had in the arsenal until the next generation of aircraft came along. Now, if we look at, we talked about Texas airplane there, we've got a good example. This airplane is configured a little bit differently. We're going to talk about that. It has late war, I'm going to take my little Flying Tiger with me. We'll talk about him in a second. It has the 650 caliber machine guns, which is a fairly standard armament for late war Allied fighters. And then you could see this big, tough wing. I think this is called, if I remember correctly, this is a 5-spar wing, which made it so tough. There were just under 14,000 of these aircraft manufactured when they went out of production in late 1944. To give you an idea, they were even messing with a 4-bladed prop of this airplane that could get up around 400 miles an hour, which, as we've talked before, is a magic number at that time in Allied fighters. So let's take a walk around the airplane. My voluptuous assistant will follow me, of course, social distancing all the way. We've talked about fabric. You can see fabric. You can hear that fabric in the ailerons. So the ailerons have fabric on them. You can see the other thing that's really interesting about this airplane is, remember we talked about, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, about birdcage canopies, but this is a really good example. You can see this is the birdcage canopy. These pieces that all come in, well, they impede the pilot's visibility somewhat, and you could see in later warfighters they were putting the pilot up high. This airplane, they never really kind of did away with that, and so that was one of the drawbacks. One of the things you can clearly see up in there, see that rear view mirror. You always want to see what's on your tail. And so up in that airplane, you can clearly see a rear view mirror. I'm going to point something else out that I think is kind of amusing on this airplane, but we'll get around the other side first. You can see the Flying Tiger emblem. Now this aircraft actually has one of the later war stars and bars on it. You aficionados know that this insignia changed. I'm not going to get too far into it because we just don't have time, but this is a later identifier to identify Army Air Corps airplane at that time. Remember, U.S. Air Force wasn't around at that point. It was the Army Air Corps. More fabric, elevator, rudder. It is what we call a tail dragger, so you can see that. Now, interesting thing about this aircraft, this is a TP-40. It is a training version of this airplane. Well, what does that mean? That means that it's got 2 seats for the guy in training back here and the pilot up front, the instructor. This aircraft, some of these were converted to trainers, and this airplane is one of them. So you can actually see you've got the canopy open, there's instruments and a stick back there, and so depending on how they were doing training at that time, you would start in a Stearman, and then you might go to a AT-6, a Texan, and then you work up. One of the things you had to be careful about with all these fighters, and the reason they wanted to gradually take you up higher, was the torque, and that is from that propeller spinning. You know, if you've ever had a drill or a screw, and you know how you screw the, when you have it like on a piece of wood and it pulls, well, you can imagine these airplanes have a lot of torque because of that spinning. They wanted to get pilots more and more accustomed to flying in these higher performance aircraft so that they could handle the torque and the handling characteristics of the airplane. The other thing that's on this airplane, and I think it's kind of interesting, is if you look at the front there, and Greg, I don't know if you can get that, there's actually one of the old, what they call iron sights. This airplane actually has an iron sight on it. The most Allied fighters at this point, this is an earlier version or an older version of the airplane, had an optical sight which was up on the dash above the pilot. He'd look out that windscreen. This aircraft, probably as a throwback to the earlier versions of this airplane, has an iron sight on it. An iron sight is nothing more than, like we talked about with that rifle, with that sight, that the two you could line that up on the enemy. Remember, if you're in the air, you don't want to point right at the enemy. You want to fire just ahead of him, and you only had so many cartridges, so many rounds. So you want to lead him. These iron sights are probably the most inefficient sight you can have on an airplane. I mean, they're okay if you're shooting at something on the ground that is just sitting there. But if you're in the air, that's not a very good sight. But at the time, hey, they were learning about technology. They were trying to figure it out. So what we talked about today is that rifle and that Japanese master sergeant that was in China at that time, and we have the type of airplane that was in China at that time. Think about, let your mind wander for a minute. Did that Japanese soldier see the P-40s in China before he was transferred to Luzon, where ultimately he perished? When you come to the museum, as I said, listen to all the stories and go and look at all the artifacts. Everything tells a story. Seeing these airplanes run is one thing. Learning about all the human aspect behind them and the people that were involved with them is something completely different and really adds something to the history. What I have here is my Flying Tiger, complete with goggles. He's up on the website, and so if you want to go out and you're sitting at home and you feel a heaping hankering for a Flying Tiger, go out to the website. There's also t-shirts out there of this aircraft and others, and so we certainly want to keep you interested and amused while you're sitting at home, we will continue to produce these videos for you. What I do want to do is I want to say thank you for joining me today. If you liked this, smash that subscribe button. There's also a donate button. We can use your shekels. We can use the donations. As I said, we are closed, and every little bit helps. So my name is Fred Bell. I want to thank you for joining us on Warbird Wednesday, and have a great day.